Well, welcome back to another evening in the Stormcave. I'm your host, Grant Walker, and I'm here with my co-host, Jenelle and Schmidt. And we have a special guest tonight. Tonight, we're going to talk about world building, which is an elemental part of a lot of storytelling. And with our special guest tonight, a creator of worlds, Janelle's husband, Derek Schmidt. Derek, how you doing?
Doing all right. Glad to be here.
Right on. Janelle, how are you doing?
I'm good. Warming up. It's
Right on.
cold
I
out
think
there.
Yeah, you guys just came from an outdoor activity, and it's like winter there. It's getting cooler here in Washington, but there in Wisconsin, you guys have been in winter for the last 11 and a half months.
Sometimes it feels like it. We had a pretty warm summer this year, though.
Right on, right on. Well, thanks for joining me tonight. Derek, I want to give a little bit of a background, but the best people to give this background would be you and Janelle. The book series, Janelle, that you are writing, that you're in the middle of releasing, book 2 coming out very soon, the Term Archive. Janelle, give me a little bit of a background as we get ready to talk about world building, um, the origination of this story, and as we dive into the idea of world building, why we're talking to you and Derek about this, and specifically you, Derek.
Yeah, well, the whole idea for the Turum Archive actually started with Derek. He was intrigued by the fact that I had written these books, the Minstrel Song series, and he wanted to try his hand at creating some characters in a world. And uh, so he actually started building this world of Turum. At the time, it had a different name, and eventually he asked me if I would write the story for the world, and I was like, no. so um but I figured I would write it wrong and then he would not be happy about it, and eventually he assured me that I couldn't write it wrong. I could write whatever story I wanted to. I didn't have to use his characters. He just wanted a story in this world he had built. And so it was very different, starting with a world that had already been built and that he had put a lot of thought into. I think some things have changed through the writing. A lot of the terrain has changed, and even a little bit of the history changed. Um, but yeah, so I think really we should just dive in with Derek and ask him, like, where did the idea for Turum first start?
Okay, so I guess this is where I get to pretend I know what I'm talking about because you guys have built me up quite a
When we
lot.
when we point at you, you talk.
Oh, is that how it works? I gotta
That's how
wait.
it
Something
works.
like that.
Oh,
That's
okay.
how it
I'll
works.
go back to my corner. Um, so yeah, the like Janelle said, I'd seen what she had done with her first books, and I was intrigued. And of course, I'm like, well, that's really cool. I wonder if I could do that. And of course, that ended up with me attempting to write a very very bad first attempt at some kind of story. Suffice it to say, I'm going to stick to my more analytical ways of thinking, which is where world building is quite a bit of fun, actually. Um, so it started with played several video games that had some really fun fantasy backgrounds. There's a lot of Final Fantasy out there that has some really neat science fiction mixed with fantasy. You can go to some of the really old Final Fantasy games that came out that were very classical sword and sorcery environments that were really fun. There's some new stuff out there that uh, can get a little on the spectrum of what people think are acceptable or not uh, from a Christian perspective. But you can also learn a lot from the worlds that they create. A really interesting video game series out there that was an original inspiration was the video game series by Blizzard called Diablo. And it was a good versus evil dungeon diver type video game where you were going up against all kinds of evil. And it was an interesting story world for how to integrate heaven versus hell as a hero and stuck in between. Um, so it was very different from, say, the Japanese Final Fantasy worlds. And there's all sorts of other stuff in between. I'd read a lot of books. There's a lot of different things out there that can be drawn from inspiration. And that's one of the things I love about the speculative fiction realm is if you don't like, or you want to be creative on your own, you go right ahead. There's always room for another world, but the world is there to give you an interesting place to tell a story. And that's where Jenelle and I come together, and she is way better a narrative crafter than I could ever be. But my role is having fun looking through those very analytical approaches to the different elements of a world that, we live in every day. And it doesn't even come into our heads. For example, we don't think about what we call our currency. We just, oh, it's $25. I'm going to pay that, right? In a fantasy world, does that still hold true or not? So there's a lot of different fun aspects that came into this, and a lot of different things for Turum Archive that are definitely not there anymore. I was very much focused on relics, and there are going to be these elements of great power, and people were going to find, the sword of so and so and the helm of this and that, and it was going to be this great thing. And yeah, no, that was terrible. Jenelle did way better than I ever could on it. But that's where it started.
The helm of this and that should make it into a story at some point.
She probably, let's be honest, she probably could make it into a really good comedy story. I would not.
Where do you start with Turum Archive? So if you have those influences, where do you start?
Great question. You can theoretically start anywhere you want, but there's some real good basic questions if you're starting just with world. Think about the story you're looking for. I'm going to go to comic books for a second. Batman's one of my favorite comic book heroes, and the majority of Batman's story takes place in the city of Gotham. So when you're looking at world building, are you looking for something that's very local? Superman typically plays in Metropolis, for example. Batman's in Gotham. These are typically kept into their one locale. When you start getting into the Justice League, for example, you get a team of heroes from multiple locations around the world, and suddenly it's this country versus that country, or you've got so you could have national level conflicts, right? Then a perfect example, Middle Earth, right? You've got Gondor, you've got the elves, and you've got Arnor that are set up in the north, and they're different regions. They're kind of different nations. One's gone. Arnor's fallen into history. Gondor's the last remaining real country. I mean, Rohan's there too. And then you have Mordor, right? So there's a more national level on a single continent. And then you can get into global level too, right? Where if you want to, it's like, hey, there's literally, I'm going to start at the planet-sized map or scope of my world, and I'm going to make this something that is big enough that, it fits kind of the rules of physics. It can be really easy to look at the map of Middle Earth and go, so like, where's the rest of it? Because it's just one continent. Is there anything else? So in terms of where you start, I often tell people where you start with your world is dependent upon how big your story is. You can write a very, very small, very tight-knit world that's the size of a city and nothing else. And many of the aspects that go into world building fit even down to that local level, or expand all the way out to that global level. It just depends on what you want to do.
I think it's super important too. The what you decide in terms of where you're going to build and what you're going to build, and whether it's going to be those locales, or if you can build a massive scope, but you also want to have those, I think about Star Wars. One of the things that I think is the reason that Star Wars has such a broad appeal is because not only did it give us a story, but it created a limitless world of possibilities where we went and saw that movie. I remember me and my brother, Evan, we saw that movie at a young age, and then playing Legos, we were in the world of Star Wars. And yeah, it might have started out as Luke and Han, but later we were just two other characters in this world with unlimited possibilities. Because it just created this whole new story, but just universe, really. So I think it's a very important part of the storytelling process. So let's talk specifically Turum, and even like what you're using. Like obviously there's a map that we can look at. So you're using a program and drawing a map, but do you start just like with sketches, or are you looking at the little local areas, or are you looking big picture and like this the whole world, and what is the purpose? We'll throw it up on the screen here. some of the, like maybe the big map, but also some of the more localized portions. So where did you start specifically with Term, and what are the ideas behind how it started to form into what it is today?
Sure. So maps are really fun, and it's another really great starting point. You pick that scope, and then you start drawing. Now, I love drawing uh, very basic maps by hand. It's a At the beginning when you're putting all this stuff together, you easiest thing to do is literally grab a piece of paper, grab a pencil, and draw a squiggly line and make a circle that, just comes back to where it started and make a random shape. Because in reality, that's kind of what our coastlines look like. They actually, the more random it is, the more realistic you're going to see it to be. And then start filling in some of the terrain. Go, oh, I'm going to just literally draw a triangle, or I'm going to sketch in a certain zone with a dotted line and says, okay, these are mountains, or hey, here's a forest, or I might see some hills here. Well, that might be a desert. Is this closer to the equator? Is this a southern part? I mean, how does that all play out? You can have fun with that. It's a really good time because there's no real rule. There, believe me, you can go find corners of the internet where people will argue about cartography and what makes sense geographically, and well, the waterways would never do that. And I'm like, yeah, but it's your world. It doesn't matter because in the end, the world people can critique all they want. It's the story people are after. The world is what's there to help it. So with Torum, I started with a shape, and quite literally, like I drew what almost kind of looked like a football. You can see it on the map, and I was like, well, the other end shouldn't look like, the right side shouldn't look like the left side. So I'm gonna go, oh, let's draw the line over here, and I was like, well, that's kind of a big empty space. Throw some islands out there. What are they for? I don't know. I have no idea. I just looked pretty on the picture. It looked a little like, oh, if I wanted that to fit on a page in a book, that should be pretty good. So that's how Term started, was literally something like that. I'd read something about in a book at one point where they described like this mountain range that went through the center of the world. They called it like the spine of the world. I don't remember which author it
I
is.
think that's Eye of
Somebody
the
want,
World.
thank you.
I think that's the Wheel of Time. Yeah.
There we go. And I
Eye
was
of
like,
the
well,
world,
that's
spine of the world.
whatever.
Well, Eye of the
And
World is the name of the first book. Wheel of Time is the
oh,
whole
that's
series,
right.
and the
That's
spine
right.
of the world is a geographical location.
Yep. And so I was like, you know what, let's cut this whole world in half. There's an eastern half, there's a western half. And so I was like, well, what's the easiest way to divide a world is usually either really big oceans or waterways or mountains. So there we go, mountains. And that's where those came from. And of course, it's not like, well, you can't have just one. So you throw some mountains over here and over there, and you just start having fun with it.
And then
The
the
other
author
thing,
came along and got rid of the mountains and put a forest there instead.
yeah, that's true. You did. I forgot
I
about
did.
that.
As you're designing this world, do you have stories or a story already forming in your mind that you're building the world around, or is it, hey, I'm building this, and that's where Janelle, that would be a curious handoff when you get handed this map. Derek, are you giving her because let's be honest, Derek, I know you a little bit, and I know your analytical mind. I was kind of joking beforehand that I'm sure some things were just like, yeah, this looks cool, but sometimes I feel like you are you have the mind to think, well, if the mountains are here and a high pressure system comes in here, this side of the mountain is going to get more precipitation than this side, and that's going to affect the ecology, and which maybe you didn't go that far into it. But I guess all that to ask, when you're handing this to Janelle, are you looking at this and like, oh man, this is brand new to me, and uh, I guess what is that handoff like? And did you have specific ideas in mind for a story that this world changed, or that helps to guide? What was that? What was that um, partnership like?
I think you should
Janelle?
start because
Okay,
you did have some characters.
I did.
So
Sure.
yeah, I'll talk about that after you tell your side of it.
I think I had three characters tops. It was really two and a half, I think.
Mhm.
Um, I'd had this idea that was originally inspired by, because in Diablo, the video game, you can collect armor sets if you want to play the game far enough to go do it. And I thought, well, I've got these different armor sets from history, and obviously that disappeared. But what that led into and inspired was, hey, here is some very, very powerful characters, and there's two left, Dalmir and uh, Un. So there were two very powerful characters that I knew what they were, and I got to be careful. I don't want to give too many spoilers away here. So sorry, guys. I know what the point is of the story. But that was probably the first two. I had two characters. They were very, very powerful wizard type characters. And then I'd had an idea for the local farm boy. Think the Princess Bride, right? That kind of character had and really had no aspirations for anything. By the way, when creating characters, don't create characters that are apathetic. They're not fun. I've tried. That's usually what happens. Bad idea.
Every time we play D&D, Derek ends up creating a character who doesn't want to go on adventures, and it's
Because
very frustrating for him.
I think I'm just a hobbit, and so it just naturally comes out that way. But
I don't want to go in the cart.
exactly. Please, can I just stay home? But so that's where the story started. Like, it was the map, it was a little bit of this history and just disparate ideas from stuff I'd come to. And then I had these three characters. I knew I wanted the magic system to be kind of soft. I hadn't defined any of that stuff yet. But here were these characters. Then a few other things. I'd drawn more details into the story, some basic history stuff, and then I had this idea about how magic kind of worked, and some kind of creativity around trains and technology it's not Magitech, but anyway, Jenelle can kind of explain that. But it was really, I can't make this narrative. I don't know what to do with it really. I'm not a plot wizard. So that's when I said, here, please do something valuable with this work, because it's otherwise just going to sit here on a piece of paper and be a sketch. So that's kind of when I handed it off to Janelle.
Yeah. And so I kept Dalmir and Un, and I tweaked them a little bit. I think originally the idea was that Dalmir and Un were like angels. They're not. They're human. Um, but yeah. So I kept the names that Derek came up with. He had come up with a lot of the names for the countries, and I kept a lot of those very similar, changed maybe a little bit. But the problem with having an engineering physics major create a world and then hand it to an English education major to write in is that I look at it and go, ooh, a blank slate, and it's got like these like boundaries, but I could change them, and so I tend to start writing and then later go, oh well, I said that they went across a mountain range here, so a mountain range has to be here. And my map builder husband gets a little frustrated with me because he's like, why are there mountains randomly here? and then as the drafts go on, well, maybe I delete the mountain range, so then he is like, oh, there are no mountains there anymore, or this town needs to be over here because in the book it takes this amount of time for them to get. And yes, so at least I think about these things now a little bit. When I wrote Minstrel Song, I didn't think about those things at all, mostly because I let people fly around on dragons, so it didn't matter how far things were, because it was basically like being able to get on a plane.
We've been flying for 21 days. Wait a second. This map is only 500 miles wide.
Right. Well, it has to take 21 days. I'm sorry. But yes.
We got lost.
Clearly.
Yeah. So yeah, I tend to struggle with distances and figuring that out. But when it came to the story, the big thing was I loved this idea of this farm boy. I gave him a few more aspirations. He's heading to a military academy, and he really wants to do that. And so when he and Dalmir meet, he's already on his way. Like he's going to be heading out. Dalmir joins him, and so yeah, so then it's just kind of an idea of like, okay, what else is going on in the world? Why, and the big question, why Graydon? Why is he important, right? Because we know Dalmir is important. We know Un's important because they have this power, but what is it about Graydon? Is it just happenstance? And that's kind of always the question that as an author you have to ask is, you've got the world, great, but why these characters? What's the point? Why are they the ones that you're writing about? Why are they the ones that your readers are going to want to be interested in and follow? And so that's all character development, and really doesn't have a lot to do with world building, other than it gives them a grounding, a history. This is the type of weather they're used to, and so when you travel them across the world, they're seeing different weather at different times of year, which is interesting to write as well. But
I think it's so important to just immersing yourself into the world. And one of the things, I've told you this before, it's kind of the Fellowship of the Ring, even the first Harry Potter book and movie, what I love about them is you're almost 3/4 of the way into it before any plot has even, you're just being immersed in this world. And so let's talk specifics. Graydon, the farm boy, the town that he's from. Tell me about that town, because I do one of the first, couple chapters of Graydon, you create a town with a history that you're just dropped into, with the festival and his family. They have occupations that make sense. Tell me specifically about where Graydon's from.
So Graydon is from a small town called Dalsea, and it's in the country of Dalma, all named after Dalmir, which is kind of a spoiler, but that's all right. And
does that ever explicit? Because I didn't know that.
Oh well, I mean,
a bit dense here.
Come on.
I kind of figured giving everything the same first 3 letters would kind of be a giveaway. You've got Dalsea in Dalma. They travel to Dalton.
It's nice that you don't underestimate your audience. I appreciate that. That's very Christopher Nolan-esque of you. But yeah, right over my head.
Yeah, okay. Well, that's all right. It becomes more obvious later. But yeah, so he lives in the kind of a small farming community. Everything in the world is kind of a early 1800s feel, is kind of where I was headed, in like kind of a Victorian age feel in terms of like technology and jobs, sorts of things, living arrangements. And one of the things that so the town, there's farming, there's a tanner, there's a blacksmith, there's a mountain range that they can see in the distance. They're kind of in the low foothills of this mountain range near a river, and there's this tower that Graydon and his friends have always kind of jokingly talked about climbing, and it's just kind of this tower out on the edge of the town. And the reason the tower was important was actually goes back to the world building, because what Derek hasn't said is that one of the main things that started this whole world building thing was his idea for these massive towers, and that there would be 7 of them in this world, and that they had been built by specific individuals. And I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit.
So very briefly, when she says massive, this is one of those things where you think like, oh, the modern day Burj Khalifa is the world's tallest building, right? I'm like, and I go, these are massive, like they're as tall as mountains, but they're proportioned like modern day skyscrapers. So
Oh wow.
Imagine something that's like 12,000 feet tall at the top. It's that kind of tower is what was going through my head, because I'm like, I get so tired of, hey, look, it's another castle. I'm like, no, let's make this something really fantastical, where clearly these towers were created by an intelligence. It's not nature or whatever. Somebody made them, but they're so big, there's no possible way anybody could fathom how they were made.
Derek looked at all of the fantasy architecture that has been passed down from all of the greats of the past, and he thought, wasn't be afraid to dream a little bigger, darling.
Exactly.
That's right. Anyway, go ahead, Jenelle.
So the tower in Dalsea is not one of those big, massive towers.
Nope.
It is a smaller, like, replica, basically, of one of the big towers, which they do get to eventually. In the story, they come across a couple of them, but yeah. Anyway, so this is another thing where, again, engineer husband, creative writer wife, and Derek's like, it has to be bigger, and I'm thinking, how do I convey this sense of scale without going, and the tower was 14,000 feet tall at its highest summit and 4 miles around at the base? Like, how do you without like just giving
and none of the townsfolk thought much of it.
Yeah. So no, the one in the townsfolk, the one by Dalsea is small. It's just like a normal, kind of a Rapunzel type tower, but
just a few thousand.
Yes, the city of Dalton is built into, like, it's described as a mountain, but it is one of these towers. The whole city is built onto and around and up this mountain tower that was created at one point by somebody. And so yeah, so the little tower was kind of this like, okay, this is the size I generally think in. And now we go to Dalton, and it is okay, how do I convey a tower the size of a city? Like, I don't know. But so that's an entertaining thing where Derek and I sometimes he's like, I want it to be bigger. And I'm like, but you have any idea how hard it is to get people to see this? So.
How would you feed the army it took to build the door for this thing?
Right.
Well, what's cool, and some readers have probably already gathered this, but The Orb and the Airship, book 1, you start to see glimpses of this, and you've created a world that's very lived in. I love, there's a scene when Dalmir is walking with Graydon and Wynn, and Dalmir, ancient wisdom, knows a lot. Graydon and Wynn, very young, maybe not necessarily naive, but, they've lived in a small little town their whole life. But they're aware of what's going on right now, and Dalmir is not. And as they're walking, the boys are explaining to Dalmir kind of what they're aware of going on right now. And Dalmir is explaining as they're walking past ancient structures that are dilapidated and have a history. And he's explaining like where these came from. And you're getting this world is kind of expanding in front of you. The geography of it, the history, the politics. And that's where I think in book 2, where it goes from being kind of this, it's a story of these boys and obviously getting mixed up with the airship pirates. But then it starts to expand going into book 2. And you start to realize, wow, what these boys have fallen into, this bigger story with a lot of history. It's not just what's happening right now. It's things that were put into motion years in the past, and factions and tension rising, and talk a little bit about that side of the world building, like the political side, the factions, the histories, the races, the just that friction, the tension that's starting to build as the story grows in scope. Like, where does that come from? Is that defined, or is that created like as you look at this map, or is the map kind of being formed around some of these other ideas?
I can start with the very basics, foundations of it.
Okay.
But then the tension you're describing, that's again back to the authors doing it. So the basics for me were, like I said earlier, I'd split this world in half.
Derek, did you build an apathetic world also?
No, not at all. No. I actually built in a very natural geographic barrier, right? Like I said earlier, there's these 2 mountain ranges down the middle and then the big forest and whatnot. But there was very much here's the east and here's the west. And it started with, okay, well, what are the different kinds of political systems that exist even in our world today? And I said, well, let's go totalitarian over here. Bad guys, simple, right? What does that look like? And then on the other side, I said, let's go with more of the democratic republic, something based more on a fantasy version of the United States, right? That kind of thing, a federation of nations. And part of that longer history of there were these 7 towers and there were these 7 nations. How did those go from where they were in my mind early on and how they were formed to where they are today? So I had put in some real basics about, okay, well, this had happened sort of in the east, and that's why this ended up this way. And then the west turned out this way, and there were these events in the past, and go. And then Jenelle gets to have fun doing the tension part. So if you want to talk to the tension and how you did that, that's she knows how. I don't.
Well, and a lot of that is talked about and explained in that part that you were talking about, Grant, with the traveling, the boy Wynn and Graydon traveling with Dalmir, and they're just kind of giving him this like history of that he's missed of the last couple hundred years of how Telmondir became like this trio of nations kind of linked together. They kind of gave up their kings. They kind of decided they needed to band together, that they were stronger together, but that they still wanted the people to have a voice, right? And they were seeing what was happening in the East, in the Aegeum, that was becoming it went from being like these warring factions and warlords, and then one kind of rose up and started to consolidate power, and that's what made Telsuma, Dalma, and Andorra kind of go, oh, we don't want that to come over here. We don't want, this dictator over, on the eastern side of the world to come over and just like, what would stop him? What would stop him from just taking over everything? And so that's where they make this alliance, and they have the Council of Three. And so it's just kind of interesting. Like for me, trying to create global politics was, not inside my comfort zone really, but it kind of, it was easy for me to think, okay, you had these 7 nations, only 6 are left. Now we're going to consolidate down to basically 2 different worldviews. And that was easier for me to work with, was that idea that, okay, I've only got really 2. And then obviously I wanted to put different kind of culture, different kind of feel in each of the 6 nations that remained. And so but that's just a lot of research on, okay, this area is up in the mountains. And so I'm thinking kind of Scandinavian, Norway, what was that like in the 1800s, and kind of pick and choose some things like that to kind of give it that flavor. Or, I've got one country, Andorra, which is over on the southwestern side, and kind of wanted that to feel very Mediterranean and Persian, kind of because I had just recently watched The Prince of Persia or something, and it was just like, oh, that's cool. So I want to give it that feel. And so there's a lot of research that goes into trying to figure out, okay, what kind of creating a lot of that tension, creating a lot of that intrigue, and helping the reader really feel like this is a well thought out, fully fleshed world that they can just step into and hang out in for a while and explore with the characters.
One of the things
Yeah, that's good.
one of the things that I do with Jenelle too is she'll get to a writer's block, and like earlier she's mentioned, how do I convey size? The other one is, how do I convey tension, and how do I convey history and all that without it becoming some history book or some engineering text? And a lot of our conversations, one of our favorite things to do is road trip, or we'll go for walks around our neighborhood after the kids go to bed. And invariably, we'll have a 30 to 45-minute conversation about something that doesn't make it into the story at all. But without talking through, this happened, well, what would the logical behavior be for if nation A did such and such, how would nation B react and why? From a political standpoint. So you have those conversations, not because you're going to go write that in, but because hey, these characters are either recalling history, or they are eventually, as the story starts to expand past book 1, you get to meet some of these characters that are making decisions on behalf of nations or armies or regions. And so if you have to think through, what would somebody do and why? Then you go write the character doing something, and then you approach it from the human perspective, the personal perspective. And that's what Jenelle does. So we have a lot of those background conversations about politics and history, even though very little of it ends up in the story. And that's where I think, bring about that richness without burdening the narrative with a third of the book or 3/4 of the book spent just on, oh, so this is what it's like in Andorra. Can we get back to the story now?
Yes, I don't want my readers to be able to recreate a complete replica of the city, but not know what the characters are doing anymore.
For sure. Well, it just makes it very real when there's a lot of gray in the characters and in the world, but it's specific or personal motivations. You have characters who, they might be allied with the bad guys, but they have personal motivations. And if they see something that the good guys are doing that maybe they want, like, they're willing to set allegiances aside. It's not as cut and dry as, oh, he's an orc, he's a bad guy. He's a stormtrooper, he's a bad guy. It's, well, maybe we can use it. And it just makes it very real because there's constantly that choice that everybody has. That I've been bad my whole life, but there's redemption. There's possibility for redemption. I can make the right choice in this instance. And I think that just makes it so much more, believable, and you can relate to these characters. And that was the question I was going to ask, was now that you've built this world and you hand it to Jenelle, Derek, um, you obviously don't just step away and say, just do whatever you want with it. There's obviously more conversations that go. And like I said, it's cool to know that behind every scene, behind every character, even if you don't get every detail, you probably have a fully fleshed out character with motivations and backstory, even if they come, through the story just in a moment or a scene. And I think that creates a world that's very, very lived in, very believable, and it really helps immerse you in the experience, the story, and which is awesome. I love it.
No, it's there's a ton more work that you could go into on world building. You can get into naming conventions, pantheons, multiple dimensions. Like, is there a spiritual realm? Is there a mirror realm? Are there different planes of existence? You can get into how your whole cosmology is designed for anything like that. Get into intelligent races. Do I have like a classic three race world where you've got like you mentioned orcs, right? But like elves, dwarves, and men, like Tolkien. You can get into all kinds of different things with world building, and many of those questions were asked with the Torm archive, down to economy, politics, history, uh, even down to, like I said, multiple dimensions, that kind of thing. So it's been interesting. There's definitely a lot of new stuff that will come out in the subsequent books, that's for sure.